It's kind of amazing. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to webinar 742, wildcard number 7. It is February 13th. Somehow, January was approximately 87 days long, and then February was like poof, all of a sudden, and now it is the middle of February. I don't know how that happened. You can still invite people to the session, and the people are watching the recordings. What has the world come to? How bored are you? Anyway, feel free, watch it. Today we are going to be talking about cultural misappropriation and the use of humor. I think I said this yesterday, but this is my favorite and least favorite workshop if I could have the extremes all in one. And I think it'll become pretty obvious why it is my favorite and my least favorite to do. I'm hoping that we will have like a raucous conversation. And if you're interested, like as far as the facilitation of such a touchy subject, I'm happy to hang on a little bit longer and we can talk about what it's like to facilitate touchy subjects. What does it even mean to be a touchy subject? But humor kind of is an in, and then cultural misappropriation is kind of an out. So to do both of them at the same time is a skill that keeps my therapist in job security, basically. The texting number again is 202-670-4262. And don't forget to do the Instagram following semi-not creepy thing because I'm asking you to do it. These are the learning outcomes for today. We are going to be talking about First Amendment rights, protected speech, the role community standards actually play. For those of you that are not on a college campus, I would encourage you to think of your organization as having community standards. Technically speaking, they are in your founding documents as well. I've done a lot of work with fraternities and sororities, so you literally make a lifelong pledge to live to a higher standard. Yesterday, we talked about belief systems. Sometimes your belief systems make you live your life to a higher standard. So I want you to be able to kind of apply this to whatever kind of organization that you are working at. Professionally, I came out of higher education, so a lot of the examples we're going to be using are from my tumultuous experience on a number of different college campuses, but it absolutely applies in a corporate and an association universe as well. Today we are specifically talking about First Amendment rights, protected speech, and why this matters. And as a comedian, I think it's important to mention that how humor is chosen has a lot of different like cultural acceptance, that what you decide to put on a flyer or how you decide to say something at work or in some other kind of public or private space, that's they're very different cultural contexts than a stand-up bar where people have paid an exorbitant amount of money for a really bad beverage to be on the edge, right? So I like to kind of triangulate what that's like. I also like to point out that I was a ceramics minor in college, and so we will be getting into some legal conversation. So I like to just kind of warn people that if we get into a legal conversation, you're having a legal conversation with a ceramics major who ended up being self-employed. No one saw that part coming. Because I get asked these questions all the time, I think I am giving sound advice, but I am not a lawyer. I am learning that I am a constitutionalist, though, in a lot of ways. We'll talk about that. With that stated, for anybody, regardless of your political views or lack thereof, I do want to legitimately give a trigger warning. I'm going to be using examples where people have made choices to either appropriate a culture, or a choice has been made to use humor around what might actually be a really painful situation. And so I'll be using images that I have experienced, or some of them I've even taken. Some of them are screenshots about cartoons or comics, etc. And in order to talk about what is appropriation or misappropriation, what is protected speech, what is First Amendment rights, we might be talking about something that makes you uncomfortable. And that is a really important thing for you to notice, where your line of discomfort exists. Does that change in your personal life and your professional life? Spoiler alert, usually, because we have different context expectations. So I want to make sure that everyone has their trigger warning. And we're going to dive right in. So give me high fives if you are ready to go by putting fives in the chat. You have been fully warned that you're potentially getting legal advice from a ceramics major, and I'm going to be using pictures that are at least upsetting to me. So there you go. There you go. Lots of high fives. Great. 5 o'clock. Good job, TJ. Okay, so let's talk about America. So anytime I start talking about the First Amendment rights or protected speech, what ends up happening is either pro-America or this like anti-patriotism thing kind of shows up. And so I just want to name that even when we say America, and usually it is pronounced that way or made fun of being pronounced that way, that there's this kind of uniform idea of what America means and what it stands for, and protected speech, First Amendment rights, democracy, things like this are at the base of this image. But I also would like to point out that this image does not include everyone. And by virtue of democracy, we are trying to listen to the voices of everyone while also not equally applying any kind of equitable resource or human rights to people that are inside the country. So I like to use this image because I think it's important to mention that the concepts that we're talking about, for some of us, are concepts that we don't ever have to question. Others had to earn, like by literally taking a citizenship test, and others will never be perceived, maybe not never, but probably not in my lifetime, will be perceived in an equitable way. So when we start talking about military service or raising a family or morals or values or belief systems or religion or politics, I just want to name that that alone is already very divisive. Some of you are like, duh. And others of you maybe haven't really sat with and understood that these beliefs and values that you navigate, maybe they haven't survived your own questioning process. So even when this weekend I was making jokes on Facebook that some people found funny, but I don't know sports ball. I was not aware that there was a football game this weekend, and I certainly didn't have like preferences of what was going on, but learned for the first time ever that there is something called the Puppy Bowl. How did I not know about this? And I then start watching the Puppy Bowl, and the Puppy Bowl starts off with patriotism, and it has cheerleaders, and all the things that are the stereotypes about professional sports that I don't like and don't approve are actually in the Puppy Bowl as well. And then, because I'm dumb, I actually asked a friend who commented that they love the Puppy Bowl. It's their favorite tradition during the Super Bowl. I was like, why are all the dogs so small? Like, when are there big dogs? Because I evidently have sizist opinions about dogs. And she had to remind me that they were puppies. And so that big dogs also start off small. I'm not the smartest person in the world, but I gave you a trigger warning. So as we are talking about this, I want us to understand that the idea of democracy is supposed to be asking questions, challenging things, putting things through your own questioning process. And that is what is protected speech, is that it leads to more speech, it leads to questions, it leads to deeper thought. Specifically, those of us that have been or are on an academic setting or in higher education, academic settings have even a different level of protected speech because of being, by virtue of academic freedom, it is supposed to be an inquiry. And so any speech that leads to an inquiry is actually protected. Now, on my campus experiences, this has come from all different places. When I think about when I worked at the University of Arizona, every single day there were people with giant signs with very graphic pictures from somehow either medical abortions or deformities in utero, these giant full color pictures. It was very disturbing to walk by because I'm not used to seeing those kind of images. And technically that is protected speech. So you can't kick them off of public spaces. So then what would end up happening is the university would spend a lot of time dictating what is a public space and what is a private space on campus, instead of engaging in a conversation about what you are doing here and how does that align with the organizational values. When Black Lives Matter has surfaced and sunk and surfaced and sunk and surfaced and sunk, same thing with Me Too movement, etc. These issues show up a lot of times at the intersection of belief and values and politics and a sense of humor. And what is fascinating to me is trying to engage in a conversation that is about more ideas When we begin to do that, we often kind of chicken out. And so we are looking for legislation, or we are looking for somehow a way of regulating what is going to happen instead of having a conversation. So my college students, which these are all pictures of, these are theme parties that they had on campus. This is not the 1900s. It is the early 2000s, but it's still happening every day. These theme parties are somehow entertaining. And the entertainment of these parties is directly related to the stereotypes related to different oppressed groups. Those stereotypes, though they may or may not be related to anything factual, there's an application of kind of freedom and humor related to stereotypes that should be leading to a conversation, not dictating more legislation or more policies about what a party theme can and cannot be. By doing the rules of what it can and cannot be, or even trying to have like a higher conversation about what they ought or ought not to be, I think what we're missing is that we are making fun of, we are using humor with real living people experiencing pain and suffering. And that is not funny. That should not be perceived as funny. And it is often a unconscious power play that folks are doing, calling it humor. And so as a comedian, I have sat around with groups of comedians and we have talked about like what is too soon, what is not too soon. Can I say this joke versus a man saying this joke or a straight person saying this joke? And that's why a lot of comedic content is self-deprecating, because you're able to use yourself as source for the jokes. So I want us just to take a second, because I know everything I just said might be kind of heady, but when you are using yourself as the source of humor and performing that for other people, that's very different than using other people as the source of humor that you are then performing for other people. Can we see how that kind of triangulation is a little bit different? Let's pause and see if that makes sense versus using yourself and your own lived experience in a self-deprecating way versus talking about other people that you aren't in possibly a deprecating way, probably a stereotypical way for the benefit of other people or an audience, performed for an audience. What are your thoughts or comments about that? You are welcome to text message if you'd prefer, then unmute or put it in the chat. But is it clear what I mean by where the source of the content is coming from that is performed for other people? How are we doing out there? Thoughts, comments, ideas? Yes, it is clear. Thank you, Denise. I appreciate that. Okay, I don't have any text yet, but just again, the texting number is 202-670-4262. So I used to do this program at NACA, which is the National Association Campus Activities. And I would do this activity where I would use different kinds of jokes, that all the jokes are inappropriate, but what makes a joke inappropriate? And then I would open up a conversation, and inevitably, and it was almost always a white woman who was a business major, who would tell me that I learned in my business classes that sex sells. And so if I want people to attend my program, I have to do something that is sexualized in order to get people to come to the program. So we're not going to have a conversation about why sex sells, which is also sexist. And there's some racism and classism and ableism mixed in there too. That's a different workshop. But okay, let's just swallow that particular reality of how consumerism and capitalism works. Okay, what are you advertising that you're selling that makes you need to do something that extreme? Because I think at the heart of your flyer is like face painting in the dining hall, right? So like without deconstructing capitalism and consumerism, why are you needing to do what you're needing to do at the expense of an entire group of people? It's not proportional for what it is that you're trying to advertise. And this kind of nuanced conversation of what proportion might be when we're talking about humor, cultural appropriation, and cultural misappropriation that is the piece that I think the conversations need to be happening when you are in an employee resource group, when you are advising students, when you are talking to your own family members, is what is this proportional situation that you are trying to do, and what is the outcome? Like, are you trying to get people to get their face painted during lunch? Are you trying to be funny? Are you trying to be divisive? Are you trying to alienate or isolate particular people? If you think about what you share on Facebook and things like this, even individually, you can have this conversation. I am a huge believer, it's a very bold statement for a ceramics minor, but often when I'm in these kind of heated conversations, the Bill of Rights gets pulled up. Okay, but to me, the Bill of Rights is the lowest standard. What is legal does not mean it is moral, and just because it's moral doesn't mean that it's legal. But the Bill of Rights is like the bottom of the foundation. And on top of that foundation are the higher standards that we have within our respective communities. Now, if we go back 700 years to the very first workshop in this webinar series, we talked about responsibility and agency. Not everyone feels responsible for 7 generations before and after them. We're really hoping that people can at least maintain responsibility for themselves individually, right? A party of one, or their nuclear family plus some, but not all. Maybe we get all the way out to 40 houses, right? Whatever your scope of responsibility is, when you are retelling jokes, posting things on Facebook, sharing things, etc., you are seeing things that are inside of the algorithm within your social media, and that is a form of confirmation bias. And so if you're talking to someone who is complaining about what they see on TikTok, for example, the algorithm is showing that person what they are interacting with on TikTok. So, for example, I just recently stumbled in to someone who redoes furniture. I really think she's funny. And now every time my For You page is almost always her redoing furniture. It ebbs and flows based on what you're engaging with. And we tend to engage with things that make us feel smart and good and safe and like we belong somewhere, right? We need to be responsible for what that is. And then we're pushing that out. And we need to stop and have a conversation about, when we push this out, is it to the higher standard or the higher community standard that we're trying to project out into the world? If it is, then it is far more likely that you won't get defensive when it is challenged. I also think it's important for you to be able to understand why that is what it is you're trying to do. So I am much more familiar from this from a comedy writing place or an advising consulting place. And what I generally encourage is, whatever decision you have decided to make, be clear as to why you have decided to make that decision, so that when it is questioned, it can survive your own questioning process by others or yourself, or you will learn and grow and decide if you want to do it again. That is at the root of whether something is considered funny or if it's considered cultural misappropriation. There's a dance between who you are performing it for and why you are making the choices that you are making. Most of us don't actually think through the choices that we are making, but we might say that we are holding ourselves to a higher standard. That seems to be kind of what's in balance. So you may have some specific examples that you want to ask about, so I want you to kind of think about them. But I want to re-invoke Joe Gerstad here, and that remember that you are not responsible for your first thought. That's kind of the innate lizard brain culture that you have been acculturated in. But you are responsible for the second thought. The gap in between is really important. But that second thought is what informs your first action. And that first action has the opportunity of being kind of an unconscious reaction or a conscious response. And the difference between those two is where your individual power lies. It doesn't mean you're never going to offend anybody, and we're not constitutionally protected from being offended. But can we explain what our beliefs and our values are that navigate our higher standard of why we work in this place or why we're associated with this similar group or what our expectations are when we are inside of this space. I had a conversation yesterday. I was being interviewed, and the question was, what as an organization, what can we do so that we can navigate the upcoming election process without anybody being offended? Well, it's a trick question, not to pull like a my cousin Vinny situation, but it's a trick question because I have no way of preventing anyone from being offended. However, I do have a way of encouraging a client to put a flag in the ground about what is the outcome that they are searching for this event. Why does this event exist? What is it supposed to be doing? And are the decisions about that event in line with that outcome and the higher standard they have within their organization? Put that flag in the ground and make decisions based on that so that when they are challenged, you know why you made it in the first place. Then you will be less defensive because you can be responsible for the choices that you made. So lots of words, lots and lots of words. Again, I love and dislike this workshop a lot. But if we can start thinking about how our responsibility and our agency shows up and how we are using humor, often at our own expense, which is way better than at someone else's expense. Now, there can be a whole different workshop on the problems with self-deprecating humor, but self-deprecating humor can at least be owned by the person who is choosing to do it. We can unpack internalized depression, etc., that is related to self-deprecating humor, but it is better than at the cost of someone else because it is being performed for a third party. And I don't know very many people who can justify a choice like that aligns with a higher standard they're holding themselves to. Maybe it exists, but I haven't found it. But it is also not about protected speech or First Amendment rights. It's actually about making really bad choices that you are displacing responsibility from your bad choices and calling it humor or calling it marketing or calling it sex sells. It's not proportional. So that's how I see these kind of elements connected. Being offended generally means that you're listening. Oh, with the rise of social media, there's less listening. There's way less listening happening, and there's a lot more opinions happening. And what I find interesting about that is that a lot of the opinions that are happening are often not associated with facts. They are not actually related to the content. They tend to turn really personal really quickly. And the language that I use is that this is a defense that becomes significantly more personal to win or to make that person lose or to be right or to make that person wrong. And that's not an actual conversation. That's actually weaponizing what looks like a conversation. So Facebook comments or Twitter comments or something like this can happen quite often where we are weaponizing what looks like a conversation or the tools related to a conversation, but it's no longer a conversation. It is a TED Talk to prove someone wrong or to bolster someone else's ability to feel very right. That's not about checking agency or checking responsibility or examining anyone's particular amount of privilege or power. I think that particular picture I think is funny is that I'm offended, change my mind. There's still the need for out there to be engaged with. So you're either performing for other people or you're needing other people to consume what you're saying. But that's not necessarily a solid conversation of protected speech because you're not actually engaging in a process that is based in inquiry. Now, again, am I a lawyer? No, not at all. I am a comedian who is self-employed. I actually took a ceramics class at the beginning of last year and I couldn't even center clay. So I'm not even a good ceramicist anymore. And I think if we can slow down enough, what ends up happening is our first thought is we need a policy on this. The second thought is we need to engage in a conversation about this. And then the action can be something stuffy in a boardroom or can be the organization putting a stake in the ground that says like this this is what our organization actually believes in. So this behavior is in alignment with it, or this behavior is not in alignment with it. And there's going to be a lot of gray area in between. But as an organization or a person or a campus or an association, you're able to pick what that higher standard is. And that higher standard often uses the words around inclusion or making people feel like they belong. We talk about equitable experiences or diversifying the experiences. If you're using those words, your actions, your performance, your consumption needs to align with those higher standards. I think one of the biggest hard conversations I often lead organizations through is that when we talk about including everyone, do you mean that? And if so, then you need to include the naysayers. You need to be able to include people who disagree with you. And you need to give them a platform so that they can disagree in a way that actually honors the conversation versus just a dump of kind of somebody's alternate viewpoint. Not all organizations are invested enough in doing that. They just pretend that everyone agrees with them and then hope nothing happens. Hope is not a business plan at all, but it happens a lot. So in comedy writing, I think that a lot of you can actually go through this process. So Mary, I see you on the call, and I think that this actually, when we were having a conversation, I think that it might be a good practice for you or your staff, et cetera, to also go to when we were talking about something that was happening at work. I'm not going to talk about what happened at work, but this might be helpful. So when somebody is writing a joke, a process that I usually encourage them to go through is, who is the sender or the joke teller? Like, who's the person doing the thing, right? So who's posting the thing on Facebook? What's the culture of Facebook versus LinkedIn? Who's telling the joke? Who's writing the article? Who's making the video? Who's presenting the webinar? Who's going to be actually telling the joke? Okay, I see a very strong parallel there. Having that solid conversation about who the sender is then needs to come with who is going to receive this. And what is interesting about kind of performing for other folks, notice like you have to really slow this down around intentions to look for that proportionality, is your intentional receiver. Who are you targeting? That's the plan. But the unintentional receivers could be innocent bystanders. If we go back to someone who's making a flyer that's using sexism about a program for face painting during lunch, not proportional. Let's pretend that somehow that's going to be okay. It's not going to be okay, but let's just pretend. Unintentional people could be guests, other people using the same laundromat, other people who see that flyer out of context. I know that when I organized programs in the organizations that I worked with, I often would use like a contagion of flyers, similar to on a road trip when billboards one after another are kind of part of the same joke or the same advertisement. So I would do something like that, but an unintentional audience may only see one of those installments. So all the information still needs to be on each flyer, even if it's like a multi-point campaign. So who is intentional and who is unintentional? I think a lot of blowups, and Mary, I'm talking specifically to you, but this applies to others too. I think a lot of blowups is that we didn't have this conversation. We made an assumption that like, this is going to go great because I like it and everyone's going to receive it and they're going to love it because we're all the same. That is a very naive stance, specifically around social media, but also in my keynotes and a stand-up set, being able to do webinars, being able to talk about these things. We no longer need to be making these kind of assumptions because you now sitting in this webinar, watching this recording, whichever version you're doing, have been made aware that this has become very comfortable and that we're not questioning the sender, we're not questioning the receiver, we're not even aware of the intention or the unintentional audience that might be receiving what we are performing, let alone whether or not it is actually proportional to what it is that we're trying to do. In order to really talk about cultural misappropriation, we need to know these answers. And sometimes it's just not fair. And the reason why it's not fair is because other people are not entitled to having these conversations. They're not entitled to these specific conversations or know these elements, but we don't either. So I'm going to take a sip of water. What's going on out there for you? How are your thoughts? What are your comments? Put them in the chat or unmute and say them out loud. How often do you as a person or your organization or your office or your team, how often do you, before rolling out something, have this kind of conversation? Who is the sender? Who is the receiver? What is intentional and what is unintentional? The texting number again is 202-670-4262. Thoughts, comments? There's a lot of ideas all at once, oddly rooted in a comedy background. I'm not seeing any questions. Okay, I'm going to proceed. High five. When we begin to apply humor and how we are using humor, similar to our own individual taste, we cannot apply our own individual taste to other people out of context. This is a road rage sign that I found. I believe we were in Ireland. And the rocks coming off the car on the left that are hitting the windshield on the car on the right, that's the sign. The expletive thought bubble is a sticker that's been put on the sign. I thought this was hysterical. I also cuss constantly. I thought it was really, 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 really funny. Not everybody will, and not everybody will get it. You're not entitled to your joke landing, but I do feel that it is responsible for us to know what the intention of the joke was, and that the unintended receiver may not pick up what we thought was appropriate. And if we can do that, now we're taking responsibility for the risk that we're using our agency for. So thinking about the actual words or the actual images, change the context if need be. Would you say this with your grandmother? Would you do this at a place of worship? The reason why is the sender, the unintended receiver and the context of where you're doing it are really important. And often we need to understand those, and that some things might be taken out of context and not work. Some things inside that context might be hysterical and be able to work. Generally speaking, we don't need to be doing it at the cost of other living humans. But that's a conversation that we need to be responsible for. This is a very common thing that is both a joke and political commentary at the same time. People don't need thoughts and prayers, they need policy and change. I would challenge that you can't get policy and change if you don't know what the policy and change believes and what it values. And what's interesting about thoughts and prayers is there's an assumption that everyone is believing and valuing the same thing, and that alone is power enough to make change. See, it's a double entendre that both are needed and neither are good by themselves. That's why it's funny. Notice I'm making a not funny face. All right. If the humor is at someone's expense, does that person support the humor? We talked a little bit about self-deprecating humor. One of the example I like to use here, clothing. Some of us have traveled. And when we travel, sometimes we buy what would be considered a different culture's clothing or accessory item, etc. And then we bring it back to the United States, and we either can wear it, but we have to constantly explain what it is. And that can get exhausting because we're lazy. So then it becomes a Halloween costume. So I just want us all to notice that we are all capable of kind of boiling a culture down to a stereotype. If it makes a good costume, that's usually a stereotype. So when I went to Mongolia after my first master's degree, one of the women in the little village that I stayed in for about 6 weeks made me something that is called a dell. It's this gorgeous piece of clothing. It's actually made out of satin and brocade. It's beautiful. And in the culture of the village I was in, that's just like a fall coat, like a house coat kind of thing. It's what they have. They ride horses in it, they chop wood in it, etc. In an American context, satin is usually kind of a fancier fabric. So I have a Dell. And if I were to wear the Dell in the US, which I tried to do a number of times, it was fun for me to be able to explain how important this was. And this lovely woman made this for me, and she's kind of became like a mother figure, and I stayed in touch. It was wonderful. But I didn't get to do that with every single person who saw me in the clothing. And even though I really loved it and I had that story, I was accidentally performing a story for other people that they didn't understand, and they wrote their own story about it. I'm still responsible for that. And frankly, because I'm lazy, it then became something that I might wear on Halloween. And that felt weird because it's not a costume. It was connected to something really personal to me, but costumes are performative. Halloween is performative. So then it became something I wanted to just hang on the wall, which also feels weird because it's really important to me, and I don't want this connection with a human in a community that I had to be a wall hanging. And now it's too small for me and it's in a closet. I'm not saying that there is an answer. I'm saying that there is a thought process that you need to do and be able to make choices about. I still have it because it's important to me, right? This is a cartoon that came out when President Trump was president. And what is particularly interesting about this, I think, is that when people were saying democracy is under attack, it was the legal system that was going to protect democracy. So part of the reason that our country, our constitution, is rooted in 3 different branches of government is to be able to counterbalance and check and balance each other. And what we are now seeing is that still the case, or have the 3 different branches somehow been infiltrated by a similar ideology, or are they independent and nonpartisan so that they can be objective and hold each other for checks and balances? As an optimist, I think one of the best things that has happened over the last 8 years is that each of these systems, there's been an assumption of what they stand for. There's an assumption of what decorum is. Just like in your workplace, there is an assumption of what professionalism is, what humor is appropriate, what humor isn't appropriate. And it's not up for review until it is challenged. So as I can keep going with these political ads, but I think what is interesting is that we can consume and then critique, but we don't often plan and critique prior to performance. And if we could critique and plan prior to performance, then we could be responsible for the humor choices that we are making, often at someone else's expense, or potentially even at our own expense, and what the cultural misappropriation of ourself might mean and show up in a joke, a skit, a flyer, a choice, something that you share, something that you forward out. There's lots of different examples of how humor is used and when it is appropriate and when it's not appropriate. So some of these cartoons, this one in particular, I think really got to me because it was about something very sad, to me at least, and it's in contrast to something that is not generally considered sad. But this is when the immigration bill went through and children were separated from their families several years ago. This is July 4th, and that these children were in their kind of cages or areas able to see the fireworks of independence. But those fireworks of independence also do not apply to everyone that was in the country to begin with. When our country gained independence from England, it was at the expense of a lot of human labor, colonization, a failed attempt at genocide. So there's a lot wrapped up in this one cartoon that doesn't even have words. The protected speech is that it's thought-provoking and that it leads to more speech. So whether this is an artistic expression or this is a linguistic thought process, and there's lots of case and legal precedent about what artistic impressions mean, what artistic freedom is protected, etc. This is all up for debate, and we should be talking about it. So this is me almost in the 1900s at the Republican National Convention when it was in New York City. For the record, I have always looked young for my age. When I see this picture, I think I look 8. But being able to question democracy and being able to question our leaders, Republican or Democrat, but being able to pay attention and question enough is at the root of freedom of speech, protected speech, and what democracy really means. That is where this conversation needs to go and lead to. So again, the texting number is 202-670-4262. Usually, I could be wrong, but usually some example has come up and people want me to kind of like work through an individual example. So again, I'm going to open it up and see if there's any thoughts or comments or hypothetical examples. I say that because some of you are at work that you would like for me to talk about specifically. So reading from the chat, funny enough, we do this with direct mail and marketing, but not so much with social media, which will change more moving forward. Right. For some reason, social media is like this easier, more casual space. But if that's true, then why does LinkedIn have such a different cultural response than Facebook or Instagram? The difference between Twitter and X, very different cultures that basically happened overnight. But most of our marketing campaigns or offices aren't thinking about what it is they are posting or doing or forwarding. And some professional associations are now actually created standards where you can lose your accreditation based on what you are posting or sharing or liking on social media. So the National Association of Realtors, for example, because so many realtors are now advertising on social media, it is an extension of what being an accredited realtor looks like. So all accredited realtors are now able to lose their accreditation or certification as a realtor, depending on what it is that they put on social media, if it goes against the standards and the values of being an accredited National Association of Realty member. You can lose your accreditation, you can lose your membership if you're doing something that doesn't follow the values of the association. And you can't be a functioning realtor without that accreditation. So some organizations have put a flag in the ground and most have kind of avoided the conversation, especially around social media. Okay, let's see what else comes in. I'm curious with the type of appropriation as an example of when a non-Black person uses Black vernacular and is still considered a professional. And if a Black person uses this language, it is expected of the person and justifies the person is less than professional as a whole. So one should not trust their professional perspectives. Okay, so Denise, great example. Number one, I think it's really apparent, but some people do not notice this. So I'm going to say something that some of you are like, duh, and others of you are like, oh, I have not thought about this. So first off, specifically for white folks and white folks in a professional setting, any other like cultural thing, we somehow unconsciously feel entitled to do anything we want to with it, whether it is clothing or hair or language or music or any kind of practices, right? So I'm going to use a really dumb example for this weekend. The number of people that have talked to me about wanting to get roller skates because Usher came out on roller skates is astonishing to me. Now, were these like latent wanting roller skating vibes that now have permission because Usher came out on skates? Smartest thing Usher did was come out with a skate line. Not dumb, right? Beyonce drops a song. Not dumb. Like there is smartness happening over there that is intentional. And when we start talking about white consumption of other cultures, there is a way to make a lot of money off of the consumption of other cultures from white people and go at it, cash them checks. What is important, I think, specifically for white people is to acknowledge when are you consuming other cultures and then have a double standard about what that thing means, right? So another great example, I think, when hair comes up as an example all the time in professionalism, conversations that I have. Not all white people don't have frizzy hair, right? So like that's a weird sentence that happens with like double negatives, but When we talk about frizzy hair versus kinky hair, there is a cultural appropriation that happens that's a quality that directly connects to hygiene, and somebody who doesn't have either of those things is probably writing the code for what is considered hygienic, because we have really straight hair. And this is what's deemed natural hair and anything else isn't. But because frizzy hair often is on white people, there is now an exception, right? So hair that naturally occurs in the world is being policed by people who do not have that hair, with an exception of people have close to or that hair. I don't have curly hair, so I don't know how this works. But even that, kinky, frizzy, curly, wavy, permed. There's a perm up here, right? Like it's kind of full circle what a perm can mean. When we are misacculturating or misappropriating somebody else's natural way of being, now there's air quotes around what does natural way of being mean. That's not up for you to determine. However, we determine it all the time, whether it is good or bad, based on whether we like it or not. That is power and privilege. Let's flash back to that picture that I told y'all that I love so much of the two people at the door and then a mass group of people on the other side of the door. When we start talking about power and privilege, if you are in a group where you have the ability to afford someone else the opportunity or take that opportunity away from them, you are on the power and privilege side of this equation. If no matter what you do, you don't instantly have that opportunity. You have to earn it. You have to be given it. It could be taken away from you. You are on the other side of that equation. This is just how unicorn points work. And because the rules of Fight Club is to not acknowledge how many unicorn points you have, because then you just get more unicorn points. Everything not you is up for your consumption, and you get to perform it. Versus somebody else, this is actually who they are, but because they have less unicorn points, it doesn't appear to be performance. You're asking them, whoever the them are, to perform your standards and your way of being. So it's a double standard, literally a double standard. So when we start talking about language, we start talking about clothes, biological ways of being in the world, preferences, food, odors or smells, what is considered smelling good, what is considered smelling bad. Personally, I hate the smell of coconut. I don't like anything related to coconut. I cannot stand coconut. I don't know why. Although I will eat a Samoa cookie. That is the only version coconut should come in my life. I can smell Indian food, or people complain about like tuna in microwaves or on airplanes. Smells good to me. It's fine. Somebody puts on coconut chapstick, I lose it. That is my world. My world is not about anybody else, but I'm performing my world for everybody else. And I'm consuming how everybody else is seeing my world performed. Some of these sentences have to be diagrammed to be able to understand, right? And so the double standard of what is considered professional, who wrote that standard? Who lives that standard? Usually people who didn't realize they are living that standard, or that that standard is conveniently in line with what we would normally be doing. Power and privilege Fight Club. So again, one of my favorite things that has happened since President Trump has been President Trump is that I'm able to have conversations with folks, and I'm actually calling out pinko commie liberals like myself right now, is that there are things that we thought were sacred. And I'm using the word sacred on purpose. I am a little embarrassed and a little proud of myself that I am still hoping somewhere there is a landscaper who saved all the rose bushes. They are in somebody's yard right now, waiting to be invited to be planted back into the rose garden. Of all the things that happened during the Trump presidency, the thing that harmed me the most, that I am still like having nightmares about, was that rose bushes were removed. That is how privileged I am, because everything else that he did didn't have direct impact on me, but my reverence for history And what those roses, every first lady has planted a rose bush, in case you don't know this. Every first lady has planted a rose bush in the rose garden, and they have been manicured since Washington. Amazing. Even the presidents that weren't married, which happened twice, they had an appointed first lady who was not a wife, but like a sister or a friend. Not saying we've ever had gay presidents, but some people just don't get married. Lindsey Graham. Anyway, so a woman planted a rose bush for every single president that we had had. I am responsible for the fact that I am more impacted by a historical use of a plant than I am immigration law, than I am access to medicine or medical treatment or medical care for disabilities or terminal illnesses. I myself am not a trans person. I am legally married. The closest I came to anything that is currently being questioned is that if my husband loses his right to be considered a human in the United States, I will no longer be married, and then I will lose insurance. I am 4 steps away from being directly impacted by the closest thing that directly impacts me. It's my responsibility to notice that. If the rattling of what we kind of thought was just what democracy means, maybe we can actually have some conversations about what that should mean, what that ought to mean. When 9/11 happened, some people remember this, some people don't remember this. The joke that actually happened in New York, the first joke about 9/11 was Joan Rivers, who I think is probably the only person who could make the first joke about 9/11. And her joke was, do you remember, what was the main lesson that we learned from 9/11? Go ahead, you can put it in the chat if you like. Most of us can't remember because that's the joke. And that is that we said we'd never forget. The unification that we talk about that happened at 9/11 only unified some people, right? So suddenly there was one particular kind of brown person that was targeted as bad, and everybody else probably got to like take a night off of being the target of oppression in the United States, because if you didn't look Arab, you got a day off. You got a pass because you didn't look like a terrorist. Well, now enough time has passed that we have forgotten all of that. We still don't like terrorists, but we are now back to hating everybody else who's not white. And even internal division of what do we mean by white. When we talk about immigration policy, there are people who immigrated here the legal way, and it takes a very, very, very long time. There are people who are naturalized citizens. There are people who are born here who happen to be brown. They are not all from Mexico. And it makes total sense to me that they would have the strongest views that are against refugee status, altering immigration laws, or coming here, quote unquote, illegally, because they have the most at risk of being lumped together. They're trying to create a differentiation from themselves. That makes sense. I would do the same thing. When we're not off topic, but in order to understand cultural appropriation, you have to understand why you are doing something. Who are you performing it
A lot of things coming in late.
Consuming it.
Wrong.
Tim, are you trying to say something, or did you accidentally unmute? I'm going to go with accidentally unmuted. All right. Can you be able to understand who you're performing something for, who is consuming the thing you are performing it for? Is it self-deprecating, or is it using someone else? And if so, why? Can you slow that down enough to be able to make a choice as to what is going on? I actually try to practice, not always good at this, but I try to practice all the things that really frustrate me, that I don't understand. I don't understand what's going on. I pretend that they have had this conversation. What is their intended purpose? Maybe. What is their intended audience? Perhaps. What is their unintentional audience? Perhaps. Oh, it's probably me. They're probably not even actually trying to talk to me, but I'm an unintended audience member. To stay informed so that I'm not in a confirmation bias echo chamber, I watch news on different channels. I read blogs from different sources. I listen to podcasts from different sources that have significantly different religious or political views than me, different beliefs and values, and they're centering different things than I would center. Think way back to the first webinar, that map of ethnocentrism that had the North Pole at the center. It takes a while to kind of orient yourself as to what's going on. But it's a good practice to understand that other people may be centering other things, and I am centering this. That is our responsibility, and that can lead to more speech. And that more speech is what is protected. That's what First Amendment rights, freedom of speech, artistic expression, academic freedom, that is what that is rooted in. And I believe it's our responsibility to use our agency to ensure that we're at least conscious and that it's proportional. So let's pretend that we can do that. Awesome. That would be fantastic. So there's 4 more of these webinars. We made it through the one that I love the most and hate the most. Please, ideally, there will be some thoughts. So text message me at 202-670-4262. Follow me on the Instagram. Remember the book club, you have to sign up before the end of the webinar series. Individuals, we're all going to do it together. Some of you are talking about doing it at work, and I'll virtually do it just for your team or your work, like 10 people or so. Believe it or not, I do actually get paid to use my sense of humor at events. I am an MC, and an MC can actually thread together an event, deal with whatever kind of unexpected things happen, which often are related to someone's poor use of humor. So if you are interested or have any events you'd like to talk about, partner as you're planning an event or a series or something, I'm happy to help. Feel free to set up a meeting. And if you use the code MC10, then I'll give you a 10% discount. How fun is that? It just has to happen before the end of the webinar series. And on theme, I am trying to support Crazy Horse Memorial. Some of you have an employer match, so please help me out because my dogs refuse to use their credit cards. And make your own donations. I will also be making a donation based on the number of people who have attended all the workshops, up to $2,024. And tomorrow, Valentine's Day, totally on accident, I planned the workshop for tomorrow is on women, cis sexism. Remember, cis is the Latin prefix meaning congruent. So, and femininity. What I think is interesting is when we talk about DEI stuff, often women get left out because we blame men for everything, but we have a lot of agency and a lot of responsibility. So grab your Karens and come to tomorrow's workshop. I can't wait. Happy to help, happy to answer questions. And if you're interested in talking about kind of the facilitation choices, I'm happy to stick around as well and see if there's anything I can help with. So thank you very much, and I will see you tomorrow.